This is the continuation of an article published in the Reformed Presbyterian in July of 1838 entitled Palestine, continued from an older edition of the Reformed Presbyterian Magazine. Having been introduced to the general boundaries and divisions of the country, let us now proceed in our travels through some of the principal cities and towns on the east coast: Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The 5 cities of the Philistines are situated upon the seacoast on the south. The location is most disadvantageous in point of defense, for situated as they were upon the plains, they were open to the attacks of their enemies. But to overcome this, they were built upon artificial mounds, and thus they managed to make up for the deficiencies of nature by the labor of art. And thus also was some barrier raised up against the horses and chariots of the Egyptians, who might direct their armies against them. These cities were situated about 10 miles apart, and they vary in elevation as well as in the size of their area, being from 80 to 100 feet in height, and from 2 to 4 miles in extent. These cities are of great antiquity, being spoken of in the early portion of the Scriptures, but owing to different circumstances their destinies have not been the same. The original design of these cities was what in our day would be termed garrison towns. Gaza and Ascalon still exist in some degree in their original importance. Ashdod and Gath lie in ruins, but still exhibit many traces of their former being. Ekron, however, has entirely disappeared, and much doubt exists in the minds of travelers as to the site whereon she was built. Around these cities were 5 walls of circumvallation, each varying from the other in height as well as thickness, commencing with the outer wall, which was the lowest but thickest, and thus increasing in height but diminishing in thickness as they came to the center, within which stood the city. The style of building appears to be a connecting link between the Egyptian and Greek, the stones being exceeding large. Indeed, the ruder the age, the more striking is it marked by the massiveness of the materials used in their buildings. And what has been termed the Cleopian style is characterized by the immense pile of rocks which composed the edifices. Connected with the city of Gaza in the history of Samson, who, when the Philistines lay in wait for him, carried off the gates of the city and bore them upon his back up the hill to Hebron, the last act of his life was employed in the destruction of the temple of Dagon, to which he had been carried to make sport for the assembled multitudes who were seated upon the roof to witness his movements. But asking to be led to a pillar that he might lean upon it, he collapsed his arms around the adjoining columns, and with a mighty force overthrew the entire building, and buried under the ruins, together with himself, 5,000 Philistines. The mode of building ancient temples, and indeed other edifices, accounts for so many people being seated upon the roof. A large court in the center, surrounded by a colonnade, upheld by columns, allowing room upon the top for the accommodation of larger audiences, who might view the operations in the area below, all the porticos of their buildings being composed of massive materials. Such was the effort of the building which Samson, by that miraculous effort of strength, brought prostrate to the ground. Joppa, or as it at present is called, Jaffa, is a seaport, and is very remarkable for its position and its continuous prosperity, which is dependent thereupon. Its antiquity is very great, and it had been noted throughout all ages of time, from the remote period of its date to the present day, as a place of considerable note. In the days of Solomon it was the principal seaport, with the exception of Tyre, on the coast, and we read of the contract between this great sovereign and Hiram, king of Tyre, to have the cedars of Lebanon sent to the port of Joppa, to be transported thence to Jerusalem for the building of the temple, which took place full 1,000 years after the first notice that we have of it in sacred history. In apostolic times we read of this place in connection with the names of Simon the tanner and of Tabitha, who was there restored to life by the apostle Peter. This also was the place whereat the apostle saw in a vision the sheet let down from heaven by the 4 corners, containing all manner of living beasts. The apostle Paul also passed through Joppa, and it was then a town of as much importance as it had been for many 100 years before. Passing through another period of time, we find Joppa a point of contention between the Christians and Saracens in the wars of the Crusades, because of its relative importance. And even now, Joppa is the great place of embarkation and debarkation to and from Jerusalem. And the cause is this, that it is the nearest point on the seacoast to the city. Its situation is upon a promontory extending out into the sea on the north and south, thus affording a safe and commodious harbor on each side, for the vast quantity of shipping which is always to be found there. For the winds which would prevent safe anchorage on the one side may be avoided by a change of location to the other, and thus a shelter is offered, equally excellent and safe on both sides of the town. From the sea, the natural location, as well as singular artificial appearance of the town, shows to great advantage, for the elevation upon which it stands is equally steep on all sides, and the houses are built in terraces, one upon another, in perfect order, from the base to the summit. The roofs are all flat, and the ladies, who but seldom walk the streets, and then deeply veiled, promenade upon the housetops with the other members of the family, as free and unrestrained as the ladies of European or American countries. And oftentimes several adjoining houses, when good feelings exist between the neighbors, remove all barriers and open a free promenade for some distance upon the roofs. There are about 10 of these terraces of houses, and perhaps no sight can be imagined of more lively beauty and interest than to come within view of Joppa, about half an hour before sunset upon a festal day, when the inhabitants to the number of 5,000 or 6,000 have assembled upon the housetops to enjoy the evening air, not presenting as such a multitude would in a European town, a dense mass of dark material composing the costume, but decked out in all the colors and arrayed in all the forms and varieties that art can invent or ingenuity can devise. The Oriental custom is peculiarly attractive and graceful, composed of the large turban, entwined with the richest colored silks, with flowing robes of scarlet and saffron and blue, and every charming variety of shade mingled in harmonious concourse. In viewing the various features of any place, those which have a moral bearing upon the community are most worthy of the attention of the philanthropic traveler. And one peculiar feature in the society and feelings of the Oriental inhabitants of Joppa, who are Mohammedans, is the absence of that suspicion and dislike and even hatred which Mussulmen generally manifest toward Christians. And to tell the truth, they have too much ground for the exercise of those feelings. For the Christians with whom they usually mingle are those who do no honor to their profession, and who seem to think that the only difference between themselves and the followers of the false prophet is that they are at liberty to indulge in the use of pork and wine, while the Mussulman may not, a privilege which they take care to make the most of, to the just deprecation of their abstemious neighbors. But while at Damascus and other cities, a foreigner, habited in the garb of a European, might incur the loss of even his life, at Joppa he may, without the least fear of molestation, wear any dress he pleases, and the feelings which in other places exist against Christians here are greatly softened down by the constant intercourse of foreigners, and the wealthy Turk who comes to settle at Joppa, imbued with all these prejudices, soon becomes more and more favorably disposed towards Christians as he finds them honest and upright. Caesarea. Passing from Joppa to the north, the traveler arrives at the city of Caesarea, which, in comparison with the former, presents a comparatively modern and, in point of style, a much more splendid appearance. It was built by Herod with a view to draw the trade away from Joppa, and under his patronage was advanced to a degree of elegance and opulence unequaled by any other place of its size in the world. The remains of Caesarea extend along the sea-coast for the distance of 4 or 5 miles, a long, narrow strip, but in consequence of the superior advantages possessed by Joppa as a seaport, it could not retain for a very long period its commercial importance, and notwithstanding its splendor and all the endeavors of its royal patron to advance its greatness, still it has remained for centuries past destitute of inhabitants. Among the buildings which still remain, and which is looked upon with peculiar feelings by the Christian traveler, is the judgment hall of Herod, the building in which the great apostle of the Gentiles delivered in his own defense and the most masterly oration that can be found upon record. Who, in visiting the judgment hall, could help but remember the peculiar language of that appeal? King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Then, as if anticipating the answer, Paul replies, I know that thou believest. And again, how forcibly is the power of Christianity displayed in the conduct and answer of the same apostle, when the king, struck with the force of Paul's argument and the impressiveness of his manner, cried out, Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. The natural man would here have broken out in invective against the injustice with which one in his situation had been treated. But Paul, subdued by the Spirit of God, answers, I would to God that not only thou, but all who hear me this day, were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. And we may in imagination see the apostle holding up his chains when he spake this, and wished that even his enemies would be free from the like bondage. The association of the mind, when standing here, cannot but be of the most intensely interesting character. Scarce any spot in the Holy Land is more replete with interest than this. From Caesarea to the north, we next arrive at the city of Ptolemais, now Acre. This was formerly a city of the Phoenicians, and occupies one horn of the crescent, upon the other extremity of which stands Mount Carmel, in which partially destroyed, by an earthquake, after which Ptolemy sent large sums of money to rebuild the town, and it was afterwards called Ptolemais, in gratitude to the illustrious patron of its revived splendor. The name of this place upon modern maps is Acre, and it has long been celebrated as the residence of the Knight Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John, from which the name of this city has sometimes been called St. Jean d'Acre. At this place, it has been estimated, is congregated more wealth than in all the other parts of Syria and Palestine beside. The situation of this town is such as to admit of its being termed the third stronghold in all the world, Gibraltar being the first, and Malta the second. The gardens, baths, mosques, and temples are sumptuous beyond almost anything else in the Holy Land. The Knights of St. John were driven from Ptolemais, where they had originally founded their hospital, went to Malta, where they became a sovereign power, made a vow of eternal war against the Turks, and became much augmented in numbers. The name of the principal town on the island is Valletta, from La Valletta, the first Grand Master of the order. At Malta, Napoleon called during his reign, but from the French it has since come into the hands of the English, who still hold it in possession by right of conquest. Acre is still a very flourishing town, and a seat of great opulence. Tyre and Sidon. Of these cities the antiquity is extremely great, carrying us farther back than any authority of the present day can determine. But that Tyre is rather more modern than Sidon may be gathered from the fact of its being called the daughter of Sidon. It is remarkable that the names of these two cities are invariably mentioned together. They are less than 20 miles apart. Both are alike in mercantile situation and interests, and both have fallen. At Sidon still exist the remains of a temple of Hercules. The mention of Tyre is full of interesting recollections. It was formerly an island, but is now connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus across the strait which originally separated it. This work was performed by the army of Alexander of Macedon, who demanded a recognition of his power and tribute which, although granted by many of the other kingdoms, were refused by the Tyrrhenians, who thought themselves secure in their insular position from his assaults. But this illustrious monarch, who never allowed himself to be baffled by any obstacle that could possibly be overcome, determined to construct this causeway, which he effected by sinking masses of stone brought from the quarries of Mount Lebanon, his workers being covered by a fence to protect them from the showers of arrows that came so thick from the bows of the Tyrians, and sometimes to obscure the sun. The work was completed in the city overrun by the Grecian army, who slew 40,000 of their opposers. This passage has been continually widening by yearly accumulations, and is now covered with a coat of soil for several feet. No place in the world appears to have ever possessed such immense wealth in comparison with the exceeding smallness of territory, the island in its greatest extent never being more than 20 miles in circumference. The question naturally arises in the mind, how did Tyre ever arrive to the extreme opulence which she enjoyed? Possessing no land for either pasturage or agricultural pursuits, she had no exports of cattle or grain to offer in exchange for foreign commodities. But we find that so great was her wealth that in speaking of Tyre, the prophet Ezekiel says, "Her merchants were princes. Her territory possessed no mines from which her people could bring forth riches from the bowels of the earth. But notwithstanding all her natural deficiencies, we find that all the world seemed to bring their merchandise into her lap. Fine linen and embroidered work came to her from Egypt, and the men of Zidon and Arvad were her mariners, and of Persia and of Lud her men of war. Javan and Tubal and Meshach were thy servants. They traded in the persons of men, and in vessels of brass in thy markets. From the houses of Torgama they received horses and mules. From Dedan they received ivory and ebony wood. From Syria was brought to her emeralds and purple, embroidered work, and fine linen, and coral, and agate. Judah and the land of Israel supplied her markets with wheat and oil and balm, and from Damascus they had wool and wine, and from Arabia lambs and rams and goats." Thus, from this enumeration of the Thus, from this enumeration of the tributary streams which poured wealth into the lap of Tyre, we may form some idea of her resources. But still the question remains unanswered as to the manner in which the Tyrians repaid their neighbors for their products. But the same prophet, who has given us the long catalogue of her merchants who supplied her with stores, has told us her means of repaying them. Thus say the words of Ezekiel, Damascus was thy merchant, in the multitude of wares of thy making, and so also of Syria, and the other nations who received the manufactured articles from Tyre in return for their goods. Thus was Tyre a mighty workshop, and the Tyrians a swarm of industrious workmen, receiving from all parts of the world the raw material, and repaying them with the multitude of the wares of her making. Thus do we see that the wealth of a country depends not so much upon the products of her soil as the industry of her people. The reader of these notes would do well to open his Bible and read the 27th, 28th, and 29th chapters of the prophecy of Ezekiel, where a full account of the resources of Tyre are enumerated and her destruction is foretold. History has fully developed this truth, that a nation cannot, without the powerful bias of Christianity, retain the accumulated wealth of years without becoming effeminate and giving way to extravagancies, which are the precursors of their ruin. Thus it was with Egypt when she successively became subject to foreign powers, and thus in turn has it been with Babylonia, Assyria, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, all enjoying mighty wealth and power, but each in turn crumbling beneath the weight of their own misused opulence. Thus, viewing from the exalted eminence upon which we stand, the rock whereupon they split, how replete with instruction ought the lesson of their fate be to us. The human mind is prone to become inflated with preeminence, and in whatever channel the fashion of the times directs the ardor of his pursuits, man goes on headlong to the extent of his powers. Thus has it ever been that the monarch has vied with monarch in the splendor of his court, while warriors have struggled to outrank their compeers in deeds of prowess. How important, then, that the light of the gospel truth should be diffused, and the true value of temporal wealth and temporal fame held plainly out to view. Let the standard of emulation be intelligence and moral preeminence. Let the goal at which all men strive to attain be virtue, and the dissemination of happiness their grand design. And no longer will thrones totter upon the corruption of their foundations, or nations be obliterated because of their moral degradation. Downfall of Tyre. The same sure word of prophecy which dwells so largely upon the splendors and wealth of Tyre also foretells its desolation and final ruin. Thus in Ezekiel 26 verses 3 through 5, Therefore thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Tyrus, and will cause many nations to come up against thee, as the sea causeth his waves to come up, and they shall destroy the walls of Tyrus and break down her towers. I will also scrape her dust from her, and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord God, and it shall become a spoil to the nations. This has literally been fulfilled. The island, which was originally 20 miles in extent, now measures about half that size. The seas have come up around it and encroached upon its borders. In a clear day, one may take a boat and row about the island, and, if the surface of the waters be smooth, he may see fragments of magnificent buildings and broken columns and arches lying upon the bottom. The inhabitants are a few illiterate and rude fishermen, who thus gain a precarious livelihood, and literally, though unknowingly, fulfill the word of the prophet by stretching their nets to dry upon the barren rocks.